Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. Secrets exist in every family. Some are just silly tidbits of family lore, like Aunt Helen wears a wig or Uncle Duke has 6 toes, just entertaining gossip shared around a dinner table. Other secrets are more serious and perhaps downright dark. These types of secrets stay locked within families and dare not be spoken aloud, certainly not revealed to the outside world. In this month's series, Buried Family Secrets, I'll share stories about family secrets that hid decades-old murders and may have prevented the killers from facing justice. Fortunately, in each case, one family member dared to share the truth so justice could be served. In this first episode, when Lloyd Ford disappears in 1980, his wife claims he's run off with another woman. But her 12-year-old knows the truth and will be forced to keep her mother's deadly secret for over 2 decades. This is Chapter 1 of Buried Family Secrets, My Mother the Murderer, the case of Judy Gough. It was the spring of 1980, and 20-year-old Sandy Burke made her weekly phone call to her father. Sandy was away at college, but promised to phone her dad, Lloyd Ford, for weekly check-ins. He looked forward to their chats, so she was surprised when her stepmother, Judy, picked up the phone instead of him. Judy told Sandy that Lloyd wasn't home. Sandy left a message and hung up, but something didn't feel quite right. She tried to shake off the feeling and go on with her day. But her unease kept returning until Sandy felt an urgent need to hear her dad's voice. She called repeatedly over the next few days, but kept getting the same response from his wife. He wasn't there, but she'd give him the message the next time they spoke. After about 3 or 4 days, Sandy was certain something was off. Her dad was a long-haul truck driver, but he'd been running shorter routes for a while now and was only gone for a couple of days at a time. If he was going to be away longer, he'd have told her, she thought. Sandy called her mother in Nebraska to share her concern. She and her ex-husband Lloyd rarely spoke, but wanting to ease her daughter's mind, Sandy's mom said she'd call the house to see what she could find out. But when she talked to Judy, she heard the same story. Lloyd wasn't home, and she didn't know when he'd be back. Pressing her for details, Judy finally blurted out with exasperation, "Look, he took off with another woman and I don't think he's coming back." She reported back to Sandy what she'd learned from Judy. They both knew that Lloyd and Judy didn't have the best marriage. In fact, it had been downright rocky for some time. Still, if he had left his wife, Sandy knew he wouldn't have skipped town without telling her about it. They began calling family members and Lloyd's friends to see if anyone had heard from him. They had no luck. It seemed as if Lloyd Ford had disappeared overnight. Lloyd Ford was born in Ainsworth, Nebraska. After high school, he joined the Navy and served aboard an aircraft carrier. When he returned home, he married a local girl and had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Sandy was his firstborn, followed by Pamela and Tommy. Sandy says of her father, "My dad was a fun-loving guy. People tended to gravitate towards him." His daughter Pamela remembers with a chuckle, "All of the women around here had crushes on him and his brother." Lloyd Ford moved his family from Nebraska to Ada County, Idaho, and began driving trucks for a living. The things Lloyd Ford loved best were fishing and spending time with his children. In the early 1970s, Lloyd made the acquaintance of Judy, a twice-divorced woman with 3 children, who worked in town as a hairdresser. Judy was blonde, petite, and quite pretty, although she had a bit of a rough edge. She liked to drink, and her temper flared up quickly when she felt stressed or challenged. Rumors began to fly that Lloyd and Judy were romantically linked. When his wife discovered this, She packed up the children and moved home to Nebraska. Judy was running a hair salon in Boise, and she and Lloyd moved in together. Lloyd continued working as a long-haul truck driver. Judy and Lloyd were married in 1973. He was now stepfather to her 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. Kimberly was Judy's oldest child. She and her mother were very close. Judy had 2 short-lived marriages before meeting Lloyd, so she was the only constant in Kim's life. Kim did everything she could to help her mom with chores and tend to her 2 younger brothers, even at a very young age. Shortly after Judy and Lloyd married, the family relocated to Nevada for Lloyd's job, and perhaps to have a fresh start as a blended family. Lloyd and Judy made a go of it, moving into a home, joining the local Shriners Club, bowling with the kids, and going on fishing trips. But Lloyd fell into a dark mood. He missed his children terribly, and now with a new wife and 3 stepchildren, he somehow felt like the odd man out. He was gone for days, earning a living on the road to support his first family and now a second. But each time he returned, it was not the faces of Sandy, Pam, and Tommy he saw, but Judy and her family, and it didn't feel like home. He became short-tempered, and his drinking increased. He only looked forward to the infrequent visits from his kids. But once they were gone, Lloyd became even more irritable with his stepkids. He and Judy began to quarrel about this, money, and the time Judy spent out with friends while he was on the road. They both accused each other of infidelity. They began drinking heavily, and their quarrels turned into loud arguments and sometimes physical fights. Judy's kids tried to stay out of the way of their stepfather and increasingly of their mother, as her temper became unpredictable. Sometimes she was their happy, outgoing mother, and other times she barely acknowledged them except to scold them and lash out angrily. Kim increased her efforts to help her mom and take whatever burdens off of her that she could. After only 1 year of marriage, Lloyd and Judy filed for divorce. However, within a year, the tumultuous couple found their way back to each other and remarried. They returned to Boise, and Lloyd's youngest child, Tommy, moved from Nebraska to live with his father. Although Lloyd's daughters remained in Nebraska with their mother, he was happy to have his son home. If he believed this would make him less unhappy and lead to peace and stability with Judy, it was not to be. Over the next 5 years, the fights between the couple increased in frequency and intensity. The children walked on eggshells daily. The only peaceful times were when the couple was separated while Lloyd was on the road. Their fights grew more dangerous and scary. Kim recalls seeing her stepfather standing over her mother with a gun pointed at her head. Lloyd's children say they don't believe these accounts, insisting that their father was kind and never violent. But no one knows what goes on behind closed doors, and every family has its secrets. At the heart of this story is one such secret, a terrible secret that will forever change 2 families' lives. In April 1980, Kimberly, now 12, was asked an odd question by her mother, Judy. "How would you like it if Lloyd was gone?" she asked. Kim may have wondered if her mother and stepfather were, once again, contemplating divorce. If so, it would be a good thing, she thought. All they did was fight and argue, and Kim and her brothers were often tied up in knots over the tension at home. Kim's only source of solace was confiding in her best friend, who also happened to be her stepsister. In 1970, when Kim was 3, her father remarried a woman who had a daughter about Kim's age. She and her stepsister, Rachel, became best friends and remained close over the years. Kim loved spending time with her father. She'd spend weeks during summer vacations and occasional breaks during the school year at her dad's house in rural Idaho. She and Rachel would play together, and as they grew older, stay up late into the night talking about anything and everything. It was a nice break from the drama at home with her mom and stepdad. Things had gotten really bad between Lloyd and Judy. The drinking, yelling, and fighting escalated even more now that Lloyd's trucking route kept him closer to home. He was home more often, and he and Judy could barely be in the same room together without an argument breaking out. But on this spring day, after asking her odd question, Kim's mother began painting a picture for her. If Lloyd was gone, Judy said, things would be so nice for all of them. Think of it, she said. Just you, me, and the boys, without Lloyd. It would be good again, wouldn't it? Judy repeatedly brought up the subject to her daughter over the next few days. Kim wondered what her mother was planning. Was she going to leave Lloyd? Was she going to tell him to go? She wasn't sure. It became shockingly clear just a few days later when her mother turned to her and said, "What would you think if Lloyd was dead?" Stunned into silence, all Kim could do was listen and nod her head as her mother brought up various ways that Lloyd's life could end. Poison? A convenient car accident? Some other type of deadly accident? Then one day, she handed Kim money and sent her to the drugstore. Judy instructed her to purchase a bottle of sleeping pills. Kim did as she was told. Later that evening, she witnessed her mother preparing Lloyd's favorite dessert, ice cream with butterscotch topping. But this time, she watched as her mother crushed up a handful of the sleeping pills and mixed them into the dessert before serving it to her husband. Lloyd fell into a deep sleep and wasn't feeling well the next morning. He stayed home, and Judy offered to make him some soup. Kim again watched her mother crush up more sleeping pills, this time mixing them into the soup. Judy kept Kim home from school, telling her brothers that she was staying home sick. Throughout the day, Kim noticed her stepfather's condition deteriorating. He could not even walk to the bathroom and needed Judy to help prop him up. Kim grew more distressed, but her mother said he'd, quote, be better soon. After Lloyd passed out in bed, Judy called her daughter into the room. She was sitting on the bed with a rifle in her lap. Judy looked at Kim and said, "It's time." Judy picked up the rifle and pointed it at her husband. She instructed Kim to put her finger on the trigger. She wanted Kim to fire the weapon as she held it steady. Kim was horrified and refused. Judy seemed irritated, but told Kim to stand behind her. "Put your fingers in my ears to muffle the noise," she instructed. Kim did as she was told, and her mother pulled the trigger. Kim ran out of the house in a panic. She couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. She was shaking uncontrollably. She hid in the yard, trying to compose herself. Sometime later, she went back inside. Judy pulled her daughter close and hugged her tight. Without any emotion in her voice, she said, "He's dead." Judy pointed to a large trunk and told Kim to empty it. She then had her daughter help her move her husband's dead body into the trunk and drag it onto the back porch. When they'd completed this task, Kim left the house, wanting to put as much distance between herself and the horror she just witnessed as possible. When she finally returned home, the trunk was gone. Judy had recently asked the boys to dig a hole in the yard, saying she wanted to plant a peach tree. Nothing was planted, and the hole sat empty. Now Kim noticed that it had been filled in. Spring turned into summer, and no one had heard from Lloyd Ford. His family didn't believe his wife's story about Lloyd running off with another woman, but Judy repeated it to anyone who inquired about her husband. Sometimes she said Lloyd had called, and she told him that his family and friends were looking for him. Still, she said she had no idea where he'd gone. Once, she even said Lloyd had returned to town and beaten her up. She showed people bruises and scratches on her body as proof. Lloyd's father hired a private investigator to search for his son. The investigator returned with several accounts of possible sightings of Lloyd, but after checking them out, he came up empty. Lloyd Ford had vanished. In August, 4 months after she witnessed her mother shoot her stepfather, Kim was in rural Idaho visiting her father. Her stepsister, Rachel, noticed she was much quieter than usual. Kim had lost weight and seemed stressed and unhappy. Finally, after a week, Kim could no longer keep the terrible secret to herself. "I have to tell you something," she told Rachel one day when they were alone. but you have to promise not to tell anyone. Rachel waited until Kim gathered the courage to share whatever was weighing on her conscience. Kim started to talk, and it all came spilling out. The entire terrible story. She told Rachel how her mother sent her to buy sleeping pills, how she'd seen her mom drug her stepfather, and how after he fell asleep, she witnessed Judy shoot and kill him. As Rachel listened in stunned shock, Kim said she suspected her mother had buried Lloyd in their backyard. Kim swore her stepsister to secrecy, saying she could never tell anyone what she'd just heard. Rachel, not quite believing Kim's story, it seemed so out of the realm of possibility, swore she would keep her secret. When Kim returned home, she discovered that her brother Shane also knew about the murder of their stepfather. Still, they didn't discuss it even when they were alone. Judy, unaware that Kim had already revealed the secret to her stepsister, made sure to keep her children bound by loyalty never to talk about the murder. She reminded Kim many times that she was complicit in the murder. It was Kim that purchased the sleeping pills and witnessed the shooting death of her stepfather, she said. Judy also made her son Shane complicit in the crime. She enlisted Shane to help bury the trunk in the yard. Over the years, Judy repeatedly brought up the secret to her children, warning them that if anyone ever found out, they would all end up in jail. Kim believed her mother, and even though she lived with a terrible sense of guilt, she was terrified of ending up in prison. She also loved her family and couldn't stand the thought of her mother or brother behind bars. Kim also had to admit to herself that she was afraid of Judy. If she was capable of murdering her husband, what might her mother do if she believed Kim might crack? It wasn't until she was an adult that Kim realized her mother had manipulated her through guilt all her life. Judy told her, quote, hundreds and hundreds of times that she'd turn herself in if it would make me feel better, end quote. Kim kept the secret that nagged at her almost daily for the next 27 years. Judy Gough filed for divorce, citing abandonment. She kept the house and everything that belonged to her husband. A year after the murder, Judy married a man named Tom Gough. They moved to rural Idaho and ran a ranch. She pawned some of Lloyd's possessions and gave some to her new husband, including clothing and jewelry. In 1985, at age 18, Kim became a teenage bride. She had 2 children, a girl she named Heather and a boy named Scott. Around the same time, her mother sold the house on Clark Street to her youngest son. 27 years passed, and the family secret remained unspoken. In 2007, Kim, now age 40 and on the heels of a divorce, was battling depression. The trauma she'd endured at age 12 reemerged even more strongly, and her mother, perhaps sensing her weakness, began testing her loyalty again. She brought up the secret more frequently to Kim, with the same warnings and manipulations she'd used repeatedly during the first years after Lloyd's murder. But now her mother's warnings took on an even more ominous tone. Kim began to fear for the safety of not only herself, but also her children should Judy doubt her loyalty. Kim's stress took a toll on her daily life. She grew distracted at work, and it was obvious that something was wrong. Her boss, Gary Ziegler, became concerned. One day he asked her out to lunch and gently probed to see what was bothering her. All of a sudden, the dam broke, and Kim spilled the whole story between sobs. She made her boss swear to keep the secret. Ziegler agreed, but unsure what to believe, he checked the story out with the Boise police. Looking into the records, they confirmed that a missing persons report for Lloyd Ford was filed in 1980. Detectives with the Boise PD spoke with Lloyd's family members. Many of them shared their belief that foul play was at work in his disappearance, and that his wife Judy was involved. In August 2007, detectives with the Boise Police Department knocked on Kim's door in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where she was living. When she answered, Sergeant Bryant Lee asked her, "Do you know why we're here?" Kim immediately answered, "My mom?" After a lifetime of holding on to a secret that had eaten away at her conscience since she was 12, Kim Wright now shared the entire story about Lloyd Ford's murder with the police. Detectives confirmed the details of her story by interviewing Ford's family members, neighbors of Judy and Lloyd, his employer, and others. During the investigation, they discovered that no less than 10 people in Judy Gough's family knew about the murder and had kept her secret. However, they couldn't arrest Judy Gough on stories alone. They needed evidence to make a murder charge stick, and that was going to be a tall order after so many years. They asked for Kim's help in securing a confession from her mother. While she tried to protect her mother from being held accountable for the crime all her life, Kim knew it was the right thing to do. Still, she was terrified of what Judy could do if she suspected she was going against her. Kim had to screw up every ounce of her courage to make the phone call to her mother, as police listened and recorded the conversation. Kim and her mother had spoken about Lloyd's murder many times over the years, but this time, when she brought up the subject, she asked her mother specific questions. "Why did you pick me to help kill Lloyd?" Kim asked. Right away, her mother became suspicious. She asked her daughter, "Is this a set-up phone call?" Trying to keep her voice from shaking, Kim assured her it was not. Judy said she'd call her back on her cell phone. Police continued to listen in as Judy called back. Still being recorded, Judy said she didn't remember much about that day, but added, quote, "I was scared for my life. I regret all this now," she said. As the call continued, Judy Gough admitted that she killed Lloyd Ford and that Kim was there and witnessed the murder, precisely as Kim had described to the detectives. On September 28, 2007, Judy Gough, now age 61, was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Lloyd Ford. She refused to talk to investigators and immediately asked for a lawyer. A forensic team was sent to her former home on Clark Street. They pulled up the flooring in the bedroom and dug up the backyard. They found the buried trunk. But after 27 years, the body had decomposed to such a degree that only a few bone fragments had survived. But they were enough to identify Lloyd Ford as the victim. The media picked up on the gruesome discovery and the tale of a long-held family secret, and the story soon made the headlines. In January 2008, a grand jury was convened to determine if there was enough evidence to charge Judy Gough with the murder of Lloyd Ford and bring the case to trial. Judy's family was divided, with most supporting her. Kim was made the family pariah for disclosing the secret and turning her mother into the police. Only Kim's children and her stepsister Rachel remained in her corner. Kim called her family's response a, quote, warped sense of family honor. Judy's attorneys planned to use a battered woman defense. They stated that at the time of the shooting, Judy was experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder due to the violence she endured for years at the hands of her husband. Lloyd's children strongly refuted this allegation, describing Lloyd Ford as a loving and nonviolent man. They said they'd witnessed, quote, no abuse, absolutely nothing, from their father towards anyone. Kim was allowed to testify using a video link. She described the events on the day of the murder from beginning to end. She told of the tactics her mother used over the following years to keep her from revealing what she'd witnessed. Some of the jurors became emotional, as Kim described how, as a 12-year-old, she watched her mother murder her stepfather in cold blood. Kim later learned that during her mother's testimony before the grand jury, Judy claimed she didn't remember much about that day, except for one crucial detail. Judy Gough said she vividly recalled that as she held the gun, her daughter stood behind her and screamed, "Do it! Just do it!" before she pulled the trigger. Kim's blood ran cold as she finally understood why her mother had tried to convince her to pull the trigger. If the murder of Lloyd Ford was ever discovered, Judy had planned to place the blame on her daughter. The grand jury voted to indict Judy Gough for first-degree murder with an additional charge of using a deadly weapon to commit a felony. The trial date was set for 2009. Judy planned to testify that she was not in her right mind at the time of the shooting and had only done what she did to protect herself and her children from her abusive husband. However, a few days before the trial began, she accepted a plea deal. Judy Gough agreed to plead guilty to a charge of second-degree murder and confessed to her crime before the judge. In exchange, the prosecutor agreed to the reduced charge and dropped the additional charge of use of a deadly weapon. Before the judge pronounced his sentence, Judy's attorneys entered 2 expert witness statements claiming that their client exhibited symptoms of abused spouse disorder and was mentally impaired at the time of the shooting. Judy Gough stood in court and provided details of her crime, but also told the judge that Lloyd Ford was a, quote, very abusive man who always had a gun. The judge asked her to explain her frame of mind at the time of the murder. She said she felt sick about it, but was also relieved because she and her youngest son, quote, didn't have to be tortured anymore. Asked to explain why her daughter was present to witness the murder, Judy said she couldn't say why Kimberly was there. She said she only remembered sitting on the bed with a rifle in her lap and hearing her daughter scream, "Do it, just do it." In March 2009, almost 3 decades after Lloyd Ford's murder, Judy Gough was sentenced to a fixed 10-year sentence. She was immediately sent to Pocatello Women's Correctional Center to serve out her sentence. She has since been released, but the details of Gough's release have not been made public. She is now in her 70s and has not been in the public eye since being freed. Although investigators determined that several members of Judy Gough's family knew about the crime, none faced charges, as the statute of limitations for being an accessory to a crime had run out. Kim Wright remains estranged from her family. Her brothers refuse to help investigators or admit any knowledge of the crime. In 2012, Kim Wright and her stepsister Rachel Ward shared their story on the true crime television series The Devil You Know in Season 3, Episode 5. That will do it for this episode of Once Upon a Crime. Once Upon a Crime is also on YouTube. There, you can watch documentary videos of each episode we cover. If you've ever Googled the names of the people you've heard about on a true crime podcast, then our YouTube channel is for you. See the people, places, and other details of each episode by subscribing to Once Upon a Crime podcast on YouTube. There's a link in the show notes. I'll be back next week for another episode in the series Buried Family Secrets, and I hope you'll join me then. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez-Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia. Thank you once again for listening and sharing this podcast with others. Until next time, be good to one another.